I can say that in the vast majority of cases, traveling and training on the road was uneventful and very enjoyable. But over the years, there have been times when traveling was not so much fun. Here are some examples of my troubles on the road. Some of my troubles were minor. Once I forgot to bring my suit to a training. Another time I ran out of gas on a freeway in Oakland, California. One year I was scheduled to do a training in Spokane, Washington. I was picked up at the airport by the training sponsor, who never stopped talking to me as we drove off. After 15 minutes, I looked up and saw that we were entering Idaho, and she had to turn around. Someone smashed the window of my rental car while I was training in Oakland. Fortunately, I didn't lose anything. One year, it was daylight savings. On the Sunday morning, I was flying home from Kansas City. In my opinion, the worst airport I've been in. My ride to the airport forgot about the change in time, was an hour late picking me up, and I missed my flight home. In the Seattle airport, the ticket agent dropped my driver's license behind her computer workstation. It took over an hour to find it because they had to totally dismantle the workstation. Fortunately, I didn't miss my flight. Some of my troubles had to do with my health. Once I was eating pizza in my hotel room when I began to get a painful stomachache. By the time I got home, I had to be hospitalized after being diagnosed with pancreatitis. That was painful. In Kauai, Hawaii, I started feeling a lot of stomach pain the night before my training. Here I am at the end of the training the next day. Within an hour, I went to the hospital where I stayed for 3 days suffering from a bowel obstruction. Ouch. Some of my troubles had to do with the weather. On 2 occasions, a snowstorm prevented me from driving home after a training in Hayward, Wisconsin, and Rochester, Minnesota, and I had to check into a hotel. On a trip to Florida, I was scheduled to land first in Houston, but there were a series of thunderstorms in the area, and my flight to Florida kept getting delayed until it was finally canceled. I had to call the Florida Child Care Organization and tell them I wouldn't make it to the training the next day. I ended up having to try to sleep on the floor in the Houston airport after reading 2 amusing books by Carl Hiaasen. Reading was fun. Trying to sleep was not. When I got home, I decided I needed to raise my rates after this ordeal. I was in Miles City, Montana, waiting to get on a plane to Seattle, when a major storm front was fast approaching. I got on the last flight out of town before the airport was shut down. It was a small plane, and we experienced a lot of turbulence as we flew over the mountains. The plane shook up and down so much I had to throw up in a barf bag. When we landed in Seattle, there was no power in the airport. When I finally got to the B&B, they also didn't have any power. The next morning, I went to a local gas station restroom to try to use my electric shaver, but there was no power outlets. So I had to shave in the bathroom at the training location. One year, there was a blizzard in Lewiston, Montana on the day of my training. Only 1 person showed up. After the training was over, I started driving to get to Billings, where I was going to catch a plane the next morning to another training location. But the snow was blowing so hard I couldn't see the road. So I turned back to Lewiston and stayed the night in a hotel. The next day at the Billings airport, I lost my driver's license and almost missed my flight before they found it at the security checkpoint. During the 2018 forest fires in California, I was scheduled to do a workshop in Redding. When I checked into the hotel, I could see the red glows of the fires on the hills just outside of town. No one showed up for the training that night. Instead, the local child care resource and referral agency recorded my presentation. That night, a note was slipped under the door to my hotel room saying that I would be notified if the hotel needed to be evacuated. The next morning, I brushed off a coat of ash from my rental car and left town, glad to be away from the fires. One year, despite bad weather, I flew into St. Louis on a Friday, checked into my hotel. The next day, I drove to the training location, only to find that the training was canceled because of the weather. No one had informed me of the cancellation. So, I went back to my hotel and flew home the next day. What a wasted weekend. One year, on an early spring morning, I drove 130 miles to northern Minnesota for a Saturday training. When I left St. Paul, the skies were clear. But as I turned off the freeway onto a small 2-lane road, snow started to fall heavily. I passed a snowplow, but a few miles later, the snow was blowing so hard that it clogged my car engine, and I stalled on the road about 5 miles from my training destination. Now what? Soon a truck driver stopped on the road and gave me a ride to town. I felt very nervous about leaving my stalled car on the road, knowing the snowplow was coming right behind. A tow truck drove me back to my car, which was now completely plowed in. We rescued my car, and I drove home after learning that the training was canceled. Sometimes the trouble happened because the training organizer screwed up. One year, I was scheduled to deliver 2 trainings in 2 separate locations on a Saturday in Idaho. I drove to the first training location, but no one was there, and the building was locked. This was before there were cell phones, so I couldn't think of anything else to do but to sit in my car and hope someone would eventually show up. About 45 minutes later, one of the organizers showed up to tell me they had moved the training location. She explained they had forgotten to tell me of the change. We rushed to the new location, where I talked as fast as I could. But the providers were unhappy that I had to leave quickly for the next training. At the next training site, the providers were also unhappy that I was so late. It was a very unpleasant experience all the way around for everyone. Sometimes the trouble happened because of the airline. I finished doing a workshop in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I got up early the next morning for my 5-hour flight to Anchorage, then Seattle, then home to St. Paul, in time to watch the Super Bowl. When I checked into the airport, it was about 20 degrees below zero, and I found there was going to be a 3-hour delay because of a broken part needed to be replaced on the airplane. Then I noticed that there was another flight leaving for Seattle in 30 minutes. If I got this flight, I could make a connection to St. Paul and be able to get home in time to watch the Super Bowl. But the airline would not let me get on the flight to Seattle, and I couldn't understand why. So, I had to wait 3 hours before eventually arriving in Anchorage. There, I learned that I had been mistaken for another person and that I should have been allowed to get on the Seattle flight. I went to the customer service desk to complain about the airline mix-up. The supervisor acknowledged that they had made a mistake and asked me what did I want. I said, meal vouchers. He said, okay. I said, I wanted access to the Sky Club Airline Lounge. He said, okay. I said, I wanted a refund of my ticket. He said, no. So I watched the last 10 minutes of the Super Bowl in the lounge. I eventually arrived home 12 hours after leaving Alaska. That was the longest time it ever took me to get home. No fun at all. I wrote a letter to the airline complaining about how I was treated and asked for a refund. They sent me a travel voucher on Alaska Airlines, which I was never able to use. Sometimes the trouble happened because it was my fault. One year, I was late to a training in Minnesota because I confused the name of the city, Fairmont, with the name of the county, Faribault. Oops. I called ahead to say I was going to be late and lied that I was having car trouble. In another year, as the date approached for me to do a training in the fall in nearby Minneapolis, I looked on my calendar and realized I didn't know the location of the training. I also didn't have any record of who sponsored the training. So I asked my assistant to call every childcare organization in Minneapolis to see if we could find out where I was to go. But we came up empty. The next day, I waited with some anxiety for a phone call from the sponsor of the training. When the call came, the organizer from a local family childcare association was very angry that I didn't show up. I apologized, and we agreed to reschedule on another day. When that day came, I arrived and started to talk about record keeping. I was quickly interrupted by the organizer who said I was supposed to talk about contracts. Wow, I was confused. So I asked the audience whether they were expecting me to talk about record keeping or contracts. The audience was about evenly divided. Now what? I told the audience that my best solution was to spend a little time on each topic, which I did. A few days later, I received a letter from the organizer criticizing me for failing to talk on the topic I was supposed to talk on. Apparently, everyone was confused about what the topic was supposed to be. Her letter also said I was unprofessional. Boy, just a bad experience all the way around. And I do not like being called unprofessional. Sometimes the trouble was beyond anyone's control. On September 11th, 2001, I was in a plane on my way to Albany, New York, when the pilot announced that we were going to make an emergency landing in Detroit. When I got off the plane, I watched the collapse of the Twin Towers on an airport television. At that point, everyone was told to exit the airport immediately. I made a hotel reservation and lay on the bed watching the horrible news for hours. The next morning, I returned to the airport to try to get a flight home. When I got there, we were told there'd be no flights that day. I saw flight attendants crying in the corner of a gate. I returned to the hotel and went back to the airport the next day. Same story. After 3 days, I finally got home. I was so stressed out when I got there that I watched The Music Man, my favorite movie, to help me calm down. Such a terrible time. Sometimes I created the trouble because I didn't take time to read the conference program. One year, I was scheduled to do a workshop on contracts and policies at a conference outside Chicago. About an hour before the workshop was to begin, I was walking through the exhibit hall when I looked at the conference program. It said that my workshop was really the keynote presentation. Yikes! What could I do? It was too late to change what I was going to say. In my workshops, I normally allow participants to ask a lot of questions. So, I decided to do my keynote as a regular workshop in front of 500 people. I encouraged everyone to ask questions throughout, and it worked. But here is my favorite story about troubles on the road. I've loved telling this to my friends and colleagues over the years. One year, I was invited to present several workshops at a food program conference on a Saturday in Lansing, Michigan. In my hotel room, I noted the times I was to present my afternoon workshops. I saw there was a keynote in the morning, so I thought I should listen to that. I just bought a new cell phone and I accidentally set my alarm for 9 p.m. At 9 a.m., the hotel phone rang and a conference organizer asked, "Where are you?" I quickly dressed and rushed downstairs. There was an audience of several hundred people, and the speaker was making announcements for the day. I started eating a bagel in the back of the room when an organizer approached me and said, "You'll be on in 5 minutes." I suddenly realized that I was the keynote speaker. I hadn't paid attention to the conference program. What could I do now? I quickly thought that if this had happened 25 years earlier in my career, I would have told the organizer I couldn't go on. I wouldn't know what to say, and someone else would have to fill in. But I couldn't say that to her. So I started walking up to the podium, wondering, what should I say? I didn't know the title of the keynote. I didn't know if the audience consisted of only family childcare providers or if some childcare centers were in attendance. As I looked out at the audience, I decided to start off in the same way I usually began my talks, by asking how many years of experience members of the audience had. I asked for the audience to raise their hand if they had been in business for more than 5 years, more than 10 years, more than 20 years. Everyone applauded the person who had been doing childcare the longest. Now what should I say? I then remembered that I often was asked how I got into the family childcare field. So I said, "I've been in the childcare field for over 30 years, and let me tell you how I got into this field." My description of this took up only a few more minutes. Now what should I say? I looked down at the podium to see what notes I might have written. But I had no notes, so I only looked directly at the audience. Suppressing my panic, I thought to myself, what are the most important things I can share that would help family childcare providers? So I began talking about the 3 most important record-keeping tasks that would save providers the most time and money on their tax return. After a few minutes, audience members started raising their hand with questions. I was saved. For the rest of my presentation, I was on safe ground, answering questions. I think the reason that the audience felt comfortable asking questions during a keynote was because many had heard me speak before and knew that I always encouraged a lot of questions. As I ended my keynote, I felt an enormous sense of relief and pride. I had overcome my worst fear of not having enough to say. After that experience, I would never worry about this again. If I could handle this challenge, I could handle anything thrown at me in the future. To top things off, the Lansing group asked me to give a keynote for the next year's conference. That time, I was well prepared. Despite my renewed confidence, I didn't ever want to have to wing it again. That's the end of my troubles on the road. Whether it was the weather, my health, the airlines, or my fault, it's easy for me to look back on these troubles now with a smile on my face. My travels were always more fun than trouble.